with plant breeders outside of the university. So either people doing plant breeding as part of a, maybe they've started their own seed company, maybe they're a farmer doing selection. But we've seen sort of a decrease in federal funding for plant breeding. Plant breeding is very slow. It requires a long time. Many grants are only 3 years and won't actually fund actual plant breeding. And sort of I have not analyzed this, but there's sort of been a trend in decrease in federal funding and an increase in sort of intellectual property rights, I think in part to recoup some money for plant breeding. In that way.
Anybody else want to take on this public, if only we had more public funding kind of argument? Thoughts on that? Well, let's go to some of the other questions. Let's go to the next two questions we can see on the screen, and then I'm going to ask Johanna to give me some others that we might not be able to see. Which is the bigger barrier to driving societal benefit from gene editing, access to IP or current lack thereof global harmonized regulatory framework? It's playing off of some of the things we've been talking about, but going to the heart of the question, what's the barrier? Matt, you had talked about
For me, it's clearly regulatory.
Okay.
And again, credit to the universities who had the original patents. I do think they have been aggressive in trying to get those out in the research tool space to get it out to academic researchers. I work with a ton of academic researchers in life sciences. They are all using CRISPR for all sorts of gene editing applications, and the technology is available for them to do the research. I think it's from a commercialization standpoint, it's probably a combination of the two, but
for Claire and Sandra, would you pick one or the other? I think we should also add an option, none of the above. Is there some other even bigger barrier? Any thoughts?
Perhaps one thing is to recognize that the situation is different depending in which field you're in, right? So there is the sort of human therapeutics and animal therapeutics field. There is the plant ag field, and there is research tools and so on and so forth. So I think that the response has to be somewhat nuanced, right, depending on which space you're in. I was mostly talking from the plant side.
Okay. Let's take the next question. How does government data sharing? How do government data sharing mandates reasonably apply to sovereign tribes? How are tribal data protected in this highly academic university IP environment? Again, it reaches back to our earliest panel. Also, some things that folks were saying about the principles that guide all of this. But what about the mandates? Anybody speak to that?
Challenge with being WARF and we're not part of the university. I honestly don't know what the university here has in place. I know data sharing around company-owned data and relationships that researchers have with that, and again, that's all contractual, but I'm not familiar with data in sovereign tribes and how that's being researched or used on campus.
Claire, can you weigh in at all? I mean, I think through open source you work a little bit with sovereign tribes and through some of your other work. Do you have any insights either into this question or just in general that relationship between protection of tribal data and innovation and sharing?
I can say a little bit. I'm not entirely sure what this question, exactly what it's referring to in terms of data. I can talk about plants. So the open source seed initiative, in our experience, has not been particularly it hasn't served indigenous communities particularly well. What in our conversations, there's interest in the idea, but also I think Leah talked about this a little bit, sort of not wanting. I think this deals with history of colonialism and basically taking seeds that have been developed by communities over hundreds, thousands of years, and using those and not giving any credit. And so at least many of the communities that I've worked with don't want to share their seeds and don't want them openly available. And I think hesitate to release them through an open source, through an open access type of framework because of that sort of potential for a gene from those plants, or even just not a specific gene, but those plants being used in a way that aren't respectful of their origin. So I'm not entirely sure of this question, but I don't know that it's that universities are necessarily always aware of that or working in the best way to work with sovereign tribes on that.
Thanks. Sandra wants to weigh in, and then Joe, come on up to the microphone. But Sandra, you go first.
Oh, sure. I'm not sure if this is what the question is getting at, but obviously with all of this, there are larger discussions about informed consent and, with data collection from the past, and then what current uses of it might look like, and, what consent protocols are really meaningful in terms of data or other genetic materials that have been collected from before and are being used for purposes now. So I think that question might be getting at that larger discussion.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. Joe, what else are you seeing in the question?
Let's take this third question down. What do you think about a prize versus a patent model to incentivize gene editing and innovation?
I mean, I guess, again, it would depend in the technical space you're looking at, because depending on what the development money is going to, it's like I'm continuing to say this over and over, if a company is going to have to commit large sums of money, then having that patent and that market exclusivity is going to be important. Maybe there are other technology spaces where you could incentivize people a different way. I don't know.
Have you seen the prize model in agriculture be successful?
Well, so there's another aspect to open innovation as we practice it. So we've talked a lot about CRISPR, of course, but we're also basically looking for facile ways to collaborate in totally different spaces, right? And so in that case, what we do run challenges, for example, where we basically interrogate the scientific community, the question, which had us stumped, for example, for a while, and there is a prize associated with somebody who can solve the problem, right? So there are initiatives like this. At our level, it's sort of a little bit experimental. We've been doing it for a couple of years. It's worked pretty well. They're usually relatively small sums of money, but there are small problems, small sums of money. There's also sort of, basically, if you're thinking about the whole venture community, there is sort of a prize there, right? Where you say, well, we're going to solve this problem, and we're going to put some investments against the problem, and these companies strive. So you could look at it as being sort of a prize-based model, if you wish.
Okay, great. I know there's great questions on here. I'm going to pivot in our just last couple minutes here, particularly because it's the last panel of the day. I want to go back to the title of the keynote conversation and just the theme of CRISPRcon and trying to ask us to be curious, to examine our own assumptions and biases, listen, learn from other perspectives, and encourage those other perspectives as well to challenge themselves in their own thinking. It's a lot about humility, right? So if the question is, but what if we're wrong? I want to frame that up to you. I guess we can ground it in the context of this conversation about democratization. It doesn't need to be just strictly to patents and licensing. But as we think about how a democratized world of science and research and innovation leading to public benefit might work, what might we be getting wrong right now about the way we're doing things? Or what might others be getting wrong about the way we're approaching these problems? So what might we look back at and say, oh, wow, hindsight's 20/20 on that one, folks. I did not prepare them for this.
Well, I was going to say, that's a stumper. You stumped the panel. Nice. That was good, Julie.
Big or small?
Well, yeah.
I would say, for us, we do look into the rear view mirror to try to answer this question. We're very much looking at what happened in the 90s with GMOs and what we did wrong there. And we're trying to not do things wrong now with CRISPR. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and so we don't know what we'll miss. But what we're pretty certain about is that for this democratization to work and for the technology to really deliver on the promise, there has to be acceptance, and that has to be it has to be public acceptance. I mean, our customers are our farmers. And so we work with the farmers, and that's always sort of, we actually say we're fanatically focused on the needs of the farmer. However, we're also very aware of the needs of the customers. And so we're probably, as compared to in the past, listening a lot more to what is going on there. But yeah, I mean, hindsight is 20/20.
Thanks. Others, again, it could be big or small, but I'd like to hear from each of you. What's something we could be getting wrong?
I think we're kind of, I mean, perhaps, like, I think, Sandra, you answered this question that you had before, which was, like, are we really doing anything different now? And with regards to, I mean, IP, and I don't think we are. So I think we're going to continue to see some of the challenges, I mean, and I'm coming from the plant perspective, but the challenges associated with that we have already been seeing. I don't know how that's going to change necessarily in terms of specifically related to maybe some of the social justice considerations. I don't know if we're really democratizing things differently than we have in the past, but.
Thanks, Claire.
I mean, I guess if I was to look back on a research tool, I think CRISPR has the potential to be more than just a research tool, and I think we've talked about it a lot. But if you're looking at it as a research tool, I mean, I look back to another research tool, green fluorescent protein, which was also developed in an academic institution. Multiple mutations were made, lots of colors were made, and that was more tightly controlled. The access to it, to the research community, it was one company. They were going to sell materials to academic researchers in government labs, and the company that took the exclusive license licensed it to pharmaceutical companies as a research tool, and it was very tightly controlled. It got out there, academic researchers used it, and it became more and more prevalent as people realized what a valuable tool this was, and there was so much demand for it. I think the companies that had been involved in the licenses loosened up some of the rules and the what was available and what wasn't available. I think in the CRISPR situation, in my opinion, I think the academic institutions recognized getting it out to as many people as possible in the research community was very important to validate the technology, get it into lots of different hands. We've got all these questions scientifically, technically, is this gonna work? From a regulatory standpoint, what are the risks? What are the dangers? The more people we have working on that, I think the better the answers are gonna be. And I think in this instance, I don't know if we've just evolved in a technology transfer community to start thinking about that more in an academic setting, but I do think in this instance it was done better and more inclusively than in a previous one example.
Thanks, Beth. Sandra, you want to bring us home?
I mean, I think I would just say to, use the opportunity to actually build in the mechanisms to advance social justice goals rather than just assuming that access to the technology will do that sort of automatically, that we really need to think about how do we support people's involvement in those conversations about what's going to happen with this technology so that we are actually moving towards a public good rather than just assuming that will happen.
Thanks, Sandra. Well, and I think Chuck earlier kind of alluded to this too, but being able to ask ourselves the questions of what might we get wrong, but also what might we get right is a starting point, and we certainly believe at CRISPRcon that's an important conversation to have, right? Both look at the risks, the benefits, where are we having some successes, where might we need to do better. And again, no small thing to ask folks to come on stage and share their thoughts on all of that. Thank you to our panelists for this discussion. I guess I could have asked you what are we doing right. We're out of time, so we'll have to make that a conversation as well for the reception. I want to thank you all with some applause.